Hello, this is Gray Hughes of Gray Hughes Investigates on YouTube, where location is evidence. In today's video, we're going to be discussing how long was Nancy Guthrie alive after the kidnapping. Now, for the sake of argument, we are going to assume that this is an abduction for ransom gone wrong, which actually seems like the most likely theory or scenario out of all of them currently. All right, so let's get started on that right now. All right, so as we all remember, at 5:32 p.m., Nancy travels to her daughter's home for dinner, mahjong, etc. And then she's dropped off back at home at 9:48 and 9:50. There must be an electronic device or something on the garage door for them to have that specific information. However, there's also a camera right here on the pool house here that films right next to where the garage door is, so maybe they just had the timing of the vehicle pulling in and out. However, remember, they didn't pay the fee for the Nest camera, so that means that camera likely wasn't recording video, and that would be hard to extract. So I think it's more likely that the 9:48 and 9:50 are some internal garage door opening digital data. All right, and so we have that. And then we know that at around 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera disconnects. And that's going to be right around when we see this surveillance footage here, right? So we see this surveillance footage, and we know for certain that right around this time, I would say right around here, when he places the sort of folded over weed there over the camera to pull it off. I think he was originally going to pull it off with his gloves, but thought, hey, I might rip my gloves, exposing some of my DNA to the scene, so then grabbed a plant and then pulled off the camera. But I think it's reasonable to believe that this video right here is right around 1:47, because that's the time that that camera disconnects from the system. And then at 2:12, we have another camera. So it's going to be one of those other two cameras around the back. We know that there's one right here, and we know that there's one right here on this little nodule that sticks out right here. That's actually the solar panel, that darkness. And I think it's, when the person came over right here. But for the sake of argument, we're going to say that there are two abductors. And I think it's reasonable to believe that somebody was merely driving the car and acting as a lookout. So perhaps a person was parked in a car right here, for example, and they were looking for any vehicles coming in or out after the main kidnapper, the person who actually goes into the home. When he removes the camera at 1:47, he's likely going to, after doing that, he's going to wait 20 minutes or so to see if anybody was notified that perhaps would show up, right? So you would think that somebody that has a brain, after you set off a motion sensor, that you might say to yourself, well, let me stand back for a little bit and see if any lights turn on inside the home. If a vehicle pulls up, maybe a family member was notified, maybe the police were notified. And let's see. And so after maybe 20 minutes or so, they decide to go back. Now they go into the home, right? And this is when it all began. So, you picture 1:47, the camera was removed. And then at 2:07-ish, we don't have the exact time, but that's when they start making their way back to the house and back around the back. And then at 2:12, a camera in the back picks them up. Now, when the person goes inside the home, he's goes in there and then he controls Nancy Guthrie. And it's at a certain point that he then uses the walkie-talkie, if we can assume that that's what he's got in his pocket. All right, so we've all seen this. If we go back here, it's right there. If you go forward a little bit, there's a cylindrical shape coming out of the pocket, much like an antenna from a walkie-talkie. And so for the sake of argument, we're going to say that's a walkie-talkie. And if so, there almost obviously has to be a second person. And it would make sense that after you go inside the home and you're ready to remove Nancy from the house, that you would then radio the other person. Okay, now a lot of people think maybe that's a scanner. Okay, but for the sake of argument here, we're saying this is a walkie-talkie. So then you would call the other person that's in the vehicle to pull up. And that might look something like this. So maybe if they were parked in that location. So here comes the vehicle around like this. And then it pulls into near the front of the house right there and parks right at the end of the driveway. There's the arch right there. And then the vehicle pulls up, and that's when he'll be removing Nancy from the home. But just prior to that, the kidnapper enters into the house, and then eventually he makes his way to Nancy's room. Now, this is an AI-generated image here, but this is what her room generally looked like. A window right there on the left, and from outside, that window is right here. So Nancy's bedroom is right in there, and her bed is probably right around in this area. And so that's where the kidnapper would have to have gone at some point, because Nancy is sleeping. And so he goes up to her bed, and then obviously she wakes up at some point, and whatever happens in there, we don't know. And we don't know exactly the time that he confronted Nancy. Law enforcement does, because obviously her heart rate would have spiked on the unit inside the home that records what her pacemaker Bluetooth is sending. All right, so then after that, he then, again, radios the car. It pulls up, just as I showed, right there. And then he walks her down the path, and then maybe the second person comes out at this point and helps with her inside the vehicle. Make sure that, just kind of controls her in the vehicle. Could be a different type of vehicle, a van or anything like that. I'm just throwing out a theory that there's two people, and he walks her down the driveway, and then he gets into the vehicle, and so does the other person. Then they drive away with Nancy Guthrie. And I think everybody can assume that this is right around 2:28. All right, so right here at 2:28, her pacemaker app shows a disconnect from the phone. All right, so what it means is like, her Bluetooth pacemaker is connected to the device inside of her house that her phone also sort of monitors at the same time. And that means that the physical Bluetooth pacemaker was too far away from her phone and the device inside the house and mainly the device inside the house, to then record anymore. So at 2:28, she's over 30 feet away from the device. All right, and then we know about the family, etc. But we're just focusing on this part right here. So at 2:28, I think everybody reasonably assumes that that's the time, right around that time, that she's moved into the vehicle and then driven away. So this is at 2:28 in the morning. And I think that the doors that were left open in the back of the house were just for an escape. For example, if the person that was in the car acting as a lookout said, hey, somebody's coming, they could just run out. All right, and the doors that were left open, one was right under there. From above, the door would be right here. And then also the gate right here was propped open using a potted plant. Apparently, that's what Ashley Banfield is reporting from a source that she has. And it seemed to be verified by Savannah Guthrie in one of her interviews. So again, 2:28 is when she's being removed from the home, and that's on February 1st. All right, now we know that the ransom note came in on February 2nd. And let's take a look at an article from News Nation from all the way back on February 6th, where it says, at least 3 alleged ransom messages have been sent to media outlets and families. So one of those, I think, is the one that the separate source that is being sent to TMZ, because only 2 ransom notes are being considered, at this point at least, that we know about, as being legitimate. It says right here, KOLD received the first ransom note at approximately 5 p.m. Monday, News Director Jessica Babula told News Nation. The station sent it directly to investigators and did not report on it until authorities issued a joint statement with the FBI acknowledging they were aware of ransom note reports. All right, so that means that it got out there at about 5 p.m. the following day. So if you think about it, you have to go all the way from, 2 in the morning on the 2nd would be 24 hours. And then you have to go another 12 hours to get to, 2:30, let's just say 2:30 in the afternoon. So that would be 36 hours. And then about 3 hours later is when the ransom note was received. So you're looking at like 39 hours later, the ransom note was received. And so when they sent that ransom note out, it was directed to Savannah, and it talked about ransom and that she's okay, etc. So was she actually still alive for those 36 hours, or is that a lie that they're putting out there? So maybe Nancy, died early on, maybe in the first few hours, but they still tried to get a ransom the following day anyways. Just as a Hail Mary, but they knew that they couldn't prove that she was alive, and then they watched some of the, Instagram messages and so forth, and eventually felt necessary, like to make themselves feel better, to say, hey, she's not alive anymore, and she, we buried her in nature, etc. And so they eventually wrote that second note, and that came in on the 5th, I think, around like 11:45 or so. The second note said, Nancy died and was buried in nature. We did not fully grasp the seriousness of her physical condition. We never intended to hurt her. She perished shortly after she was taken. We believe it was heart-related. Nothing you could have done could have changed the outcome. We are truly sorry. So what they're saying is, even if you had sent in the ransom, it wouldn't have saved her. So that almost sort of indicates that the death was either right around the time the ransom note was sent, or it was before. And if that's true, that means they sort of lied in the first ransom note. And we know that in the first and second ransom note, they use the word we. So when you have we there, you have the walkie-talkie, it sort of indicates that there may have been multiple people, at least two, one driving the vehicle and one that goes inside the house and takes Nancy out of the house. But I think it's interesting to try to figure out how long Nancy may have been alive. I mean, it's just, I guess it's speculation, but I'd like to know what you guys think in the comment section. But based on the wording and the timing of things, when do you think Nancy Guthrie passed away? And if she was alive, did they, make sure that she was comfortable in any way? Did they give her food? Did they let her use the restroom, etc.? I mean, those are just things to think about. I don't know if that's really relevant, that portion there. But what we're discussing is how long was she alive? So put a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. It's really kind of an interesting case. Also, let me know if you guys think that there's any validity to these secondary sort of ransom notes that TMZ's getting. I was actually wondering if that person actually could be one of the kidnappers, but now is pretending to be somebody else to try to get some sort of money in some way. Because it's interesting that they're also using Bitcoin the sort of the same way that the original kidnappers were using, and he claims he has this video, etc., knows where she is, so maybe he's trying to figure out a way to get it. But I think that it's most likely that that secondary ransom writer is bogus. Because why wouldn't you just contact the FBI or law enforcement and say, hey, I know where she is, but I'd like to get the reward, and I also need protection because the two people know who I am, etc. Instead, they're willing to just get $50,000 or $60,000, which is Bitcoin right now, instead of $1 million. But it could indicate that they are the original ransom seeker and just trying to get another, bite at the apple. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that are interesting to talk about and to think about. But for this video, I want you guys to focus in on the, how long was she alive? Because the information that we are receiving indicates that she was alive at least for, 39 hours. Because you go, again, if you go from, 2:30 in the morning, she was removed from the home. So 2:30 in the morning the next day is 24 hours. And then 12 hours later is 2:30 in the afternoon. So that would be 36 hours. And then about 2.5 hours later, 38.5 hours total, is when the ransom note was sent or received at the news station. And in that letter, it indicated that Nancy was still alive. So was she alive right then, or had she already died? Because they said she died shortly after the abduction. So that would mean that that ransom note, the first one, was bogus. Or, I mean, it could have been a legitimate ransom note, but they knew that she wasn't alive. If she's still alive, they would have to try to maintain her life, keep her alive. So they would have to be taking care of her during that 38.5 hours. And it could have even been longer, I guess, because the next note came 3 days after that saying she's not alive, but they said that she passed away shortly after. If we look at that again, it says she perished shortly after she was taken. So for me, that means like shortly, like within an hour or so. So my opinion is that Nancy Guthrie was not alive when they wrote the first ransom note, and they lied in the ransom note saying that she was still alive. And then eventually they told, quote, the truth that she passed away early on in the second ransom note, and there was absolutely nothing that could have been done. So even if Savannah had sent in the ransom, it wouldn't have saved Nancy Guthrie. All right, everybody. That's all I've got for this one. I really appreciate you watching. Leave comments in the comments section. Let me know what you think. And just remember, everybody, location is evidence. Thank you very much for watching. And as I always say, until next time, be safe out there.